Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening for what we hope to be a very enlightening talk about the future of smart cities. My name is Dina. I'm the co-chair of ULI Ottawa, along with my colleague, Evan Garfunkel. We're honored to host you here today at the Ottawa Art Gallery that's built on unceded Anishinaabe Algonquin territory. The peoples of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation have lived on this territory for millennia. Their culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. We're also, next slide, please. We're also honored to have the support of numerous great, generous hosts, sponsors this year. Thank you all for your contributions to ULI Ottawa. Next, please. Before we begin this evening's program, we'd like to bring your attention to some upcoming events happening at ULI Ottawa. We have happening on May 22nd, the Canada North Business Park event, the Sino-Canadian Housing Series happening June 7th, and our much anticipated ULI Annual Summer Social happening June 13th. Please make sure to subscribe to the ULI Ottawa newsletter to receive updates and event details. ULI Ottawa is a community of developers, architects, policymakers, urban designers, and real estate professionals that host a series of events around the Greater Ottawa region, and planners, that's right, and planners, and a variety of other types of people. And we host a series of really interesting talks, tours, events throughout the year. If you'd like to join us, please come speak to us or look at our website. We have newsletters that update everybody on events and activities happening in the city. And to the students that are in the room, ULI Ottawa is a great way to meet other professionals within the city and to simply learn about many of the ongoing city building related matters within the city of Ottawa. Next, please. Great. Without further ado, let's dive into the topic for tonight's discussion. I'd like to introduce our guest speakers, starting with Sean Silcoff, our event moderator. Next, please. Great. Sean is Globe and Mail lead technology reporter, a role for which he covers the financial, technological, and policy backdrop of Canada's innovation sector. He's won 3 national newspaper awards and was the co-author of Losing the Signal, the spectacular rise and fall of BlackBerry, which was released in May 2015 and won the National Business Book Award. It was adapted last year into the movie BlackBerry. We are thrilled to have you join us here today, Sean. Our guest speaker this evening is award-winning author Josh O'Kane. Josh has been the Globe and Mail's lead art reporter for the past year, but prior to that was the newspaper City of Toronto-based technology reporter where he worked regularly with Sean. In that job, he covered the rise and fall of Sidewalk Labs, the Google side project that promised to build a neighborhood for the future of Toronto's waterfront, and later expanded his many stories and investigations into the best-selling book Sideways, the city Google couldn't buy. It was the finalist for the Writers' Trust Shaughnessy Cohen Award Prize for Political Writing and nominated for the National Business Book Award. Please welcome me and welcoming them to the stage. And then one more announcement before we begin the talk. The book will be available for purchase at the end of the talk as well.
Hello. Thank you, everybody, for coming out on a brutal weather day that is only going to get more brutal when you leave. So thank you. If you feel bad about that, I have to fly back to Toronto at 6 a.m. tomorrow, and I have multiple reasons to not want to be on a 6 a.m. flight. So again, thank you very much to everyone for coming out to this. It's really great to see you all.
Let me translate that into Ottawa. We get to cross-country ski again. Thanks, everyone. Great to be here. Before we start, I want to thank the Ottawa chapter of the ULI for hosting this event, all the great sponsors, and to the Ottawa Art Gallery, which is one of the best recent additions to the city's urban landscape. Yeah, I love this space. That's great. It's not just the federal government that builds giant things for us to go to. And thanks, of course, to Josh. I'm looking forward to this great conversation. So I'm Sean. You've heard about me. Josh used to write about tech for the Globe. We miss him badly, but the arts section has benefited from a lot of great coverage that he's done. So one of Josh's first big assignments on the tech beat In fact, I knew it was a story that was coming because I'd heard about this big issue that was brewing, and I couldn't wait for Josh to start so that he could dig in, and dig in he did. Was the big story that we're going to talk about tonight, which turned into a string of scoops and features, and eventually a book and a play, which maybe we can talk about as well, on the subject of Sidewalk Labs. So, brief introduction. In 2017, an affiliate of Google called Sidewalk Labs came into Toronto with idealistic sounding plans to reimagine urban planning, quote, from the internet up. Let the hair on the back of your neck stand up immediately. Google promised a utopia that would begin on 12 acres of prime brownfield undeveloped land along the shore of Lake Ontario. What happened instead was a 2.5-year battle over the future of cities and their development over data ownership and regulation, and which tested the power of the private sector and the public realm. So, Josh, start by telling us a little bit about yourself. This wasn't your first book, and in fact, your first book was about something entirely different. Tell us about your career in a nutshell prior to this.
So I became a journalist accidentally when I wrote a review of a William Shatner CD 20 years ago because I was bored, and I had intertwined culture writing and news writing for many, many years. I like to say I accidentally became a business writer. I was just sort of thrown into that in my second contract at the Globe more than a decade ago. And just this thing that happens to me all the time is I just get so deeply, deeply obsessed with a story. I want to learn everything about it. When I was a kid, it was about the Final Fantasy video games. And then I like, good, there's a woo. We can talk about Rebirth after. But in 2014, I started working on my first book, which was a biography of the musician Joel Plaskett. And I became obsessed with his music and wanted to learn absolutely everything about it because I am originally from the Maritimes. I had left the Maritimes to get a job in journalism. I don't know if you've heard, but it is hard to get a job in journalism these days. So I sought the city of Toronto, and a lot of his music is about leaving the Maritimes and the people he's watched leave. I wound up writing a book and just becoming obsessed with that. Shortly after that book came out in 2016, I wound up joining the tech team, where I was sort of like, oh, wonder what music book should I write? And I have all these half-written book proposals on my hard drive that should never see the light of day. And then this Sidewalk Labs project came along, and for 2.5 years, it was sort of the main file that I covered as a technology reporter at the Globe. And when it was canceled in May 2020, which we will sort of go through that narrative, I'm sure, over the course of this conversation, I realized that I had accidentally become obsessed with another story, and I decided to pitch a book about it, in part thanks to Sean. The second it was canceled, he called me and said, we got to get you an agent. So this is his fault. So that was sort of how I accidentally wound up going from writing William Shatner CD reviews to writing investigative technology books.
So set the scene for us. You start covering this story, and for people here who don't necessarily know what played out, what were you walking into, and what was the situation at that time?
So what happened was this, as you said, in October of 2017, all three levels of government, just Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, then Premier Kathleen Wynne, then Mayor John Tory, all rolled out the red carpet for this strange Google affiliate that no one had ever heard of, really, called Sidewalk Labs. They had appeared in like a couple of the stories in The Guardian, this weird traffic parking pilot that they had been trying to do in Columbus, Ohio, but no one had heard of this company. But here they were in Toronto, a city that is deeply, deeply insecure, which usually when I'm not in Toronto, I get a round of applause for that, for someone actually who lives in Toronto who's willing to admit that. And they were just so stoked to be adjacent to Silicon Valley greatness. And Sidewalk Labs rolls in. They've got these big 200-page sort of announcement document, big slideshows, all these renderings that it's hard to tell if they were even possible to ever become reality. They wanted to create this magical city with monorail pods zipping around from different parts of this neighborhood. They wanted to have co-working spaces on ground floors that would turn into tapas bars and have AI-powered AI-powered intersection lighting that would adapt to different circumstances. Garbage-moving robots, AI-powered heating and cooling. They used every kind of buzzword that you could have imagined with a lot of different products that were either already in the market or had components that could have been in the market if people were willing to sort of put in the effort to commercialize them, and put them in a sort of a plan for a neighborhood. And governments were just absolutely smitten. What people, I think, didn't necessarily know very much about at the time, that this was run by, this Sidewalk Labs is welcomed to Toronto by this semi-obscure government agency called Waterfront Toronto, which is sort of basically tasked with turning the derelict waterfront in Toronto into something more livable, something less post-industrial and more accessible to the public. The city is very much cut off from its waterfront by everyone's favorite highway, the Gardiner Expressway, and they're just trying to sort of, make it so that every time you see a picture of the Toronto skyline, you don't squint and wonder what's in front of that expressway. And so this obscure government agency puts out these bids, Sidewalk Labs comes in, and these governments that really don't pay that much attention to Waterfront Toronto, with the exception of like the key bureaucrats in like Infrastructure Canada and places like that, they're like, oh, whoa, Google's coming? And so, the top members of all those governments came up. And it was very, very warmly welcomed. And then very soon after that, people started asking questions like, what is this company that has had a series of, privacy gaffes over the past decade? What is it doing and wanting to build a neighborhood, and what is actually at stake here? And that is also when I joined the Globe's tech team and started asking those questions.
It was a different era as well. 2017 was like peak tech. That was the year the Liberals rolled out their first big innovation budget. There wasn't, I don't think the term surveillance capitalism was quite a thing yet. I think there was still a lot of utopian views about tech. AI was going through kind of its first big hype cycle since the I guess it was the peaking since Jeff Hinton's group had won their competition a few years earlier. What do you remember about that era and about the sort of euphoria? And unicorns were everywhere, of course, companies that are valued at $1 billion by investors. What are your memories of that kind of hothouse environment and the magical thinking that was going on?
Well, my main memory is not wanting to be a tech reporter because I didn't care for that kind of exuberance. And when you and our colleagues invited me to be part of the team, I very much did not want to be a part of the exuberance. I wanted to treat them like you would treat any other sort of sector, so to speak, and actually try to figure out what the actual impacts were going to be on society. And this was being the biggest project that I wound up covering in that job. I was very interested in trying to figure out, like, what is the end game here? Google at the time was approaching $1 billion market capitalization. I believe it's now more than doubled that. I haven't looked in a little while, but this is an organization that is ruthless about creating value for shareholders. But shareholders are not the members of the public. They are a subset of, frankly, often an already privileged class. And what I wanted to know was, what was the differential of the experience going to be between the shareholder class and the public? That was not the prevailing view at the time. The prevailing view, going back to our prime minister, Justin Trudeau, was very, very, very focused on photo ops and bringing in these, basically, I guess we can call them branch plants of big Silicon Valley or West Coast American technology companies, because at the time, it was cool to have a job at Facebook or Google, and the sort of middle-class target of voters that Canadian political parties tend to target, those groups of people wanted their kids who probably could but probably weren't voting to get jobs at these companies because they paid really well and they were sort of at the forefront of what seemed progressive. And we can get into this argument later, but there was a lot of conflation at the time between progress in technology and progress in society, which kind of started eroding 6 months later with what became known as the techlash, which sort of was kind of launched by the Cambridge Analytica data misuse scandal, when people found out their data was being used for political campaigns against their wishes.
And Google, of course, was, at this time is sitting on an enormous treasury because they've got the lock on the search market and they've got YouTube. So they've got all this money that's coming in, high profits and dreamers, I guess, or big visionaries, I suppose, at the top. Tell us a little bit about, you delved a little bit into one of the founders and I guess his worldview of that ultimately shaped the project, I guess shaped the thinking that became the project. Tell us a little bit about, take us into the mind of the co-founder of Google.
Yeah, so Larry Page was the co-founder of Google. He's the quiet one. Sergey Brin is a little bit more gregarious, a little bit more outspoken. But Larry Page was always sort of the more intense coder type. And he believed that most of the world was, and he's not wrong in the beginning of this argument, and that most of the world is very, very inefficient, and that disruption, much like he did in numerous ways with Google, from the way the world finds information to the way the world gets around through maps, the way the world uses email, the way the world, like, you can go on and on and on. And he wanted to move that thinking into more ambitious areas. He was thinking in the early 2010s, when the idea of Sidewalk Labs first began to coalesce, he was really thinking about, like, can I disrupt airports? Can I disrupt cities? And one of the things that I became obsessed with when I was researching for the Globe and later this book was, how did Sidewalk Labs originate? And it originated in a secretive group of really only 8 to 12 people who were basically assigned to figure out, like, how could we disrupt cities? And they gave Larry Page regular status reports, and I got access to some of these over the course of my reporting. And what they wanted to do at first was build a floating city at the sea where they would not be beholden by any country's regulation. That's like, they basically wanted to make Atlantis.
That's the tech CEO fever dream, right?
Yeah.
A land of no regulation.
And guess what? They're still doing that, which we can get into closer to the end. But eventually, once Larry Page's team of brilliant people told him that the sea has laws, they decided to stop Atlantis, and they started thinking about, like, how could we minimize regulation to add experimentation possibilities within cities around the world. And so they started thinking, like, can we work with indigenous nations who are not necessarily beholden to the same laws as the rest of the American people? The American people. They're separate nations. My apologies. But in the same plots of land, they started trying to figure out, well, what if we try an Olympic bid style competition to, can we find what city will give us the most, that we will not be beholden to what any other developer might be beholden to? And then that was the idea that stuck. And for the course of 2014 through mid-2016, this group of people expanded into the company that was eventually called Sidewalk Labs, where they created this sort of big book that internally they called the Yellow Book, where they came up with all of these potential ideas that they could shop around to cities to be like, we'll put a big dome over our neighborhood, and they did come up with feasibility studies that were sort of like back of napkin ones. Like the dome one was, if you put a dome over like a 12-acre neighborhood, you could minimize the construction costs of any of the buildings in there, because they wouldn't need any HVAC necessarily, because all the heating and cooling would be under the dome. And therefore, if you save 10% off the building costs, you could then build more cheaply. So this is the kind of logic they were working with. Anyway, they presented this big idea to Larry Page in May 2016, and he thought it wasn't innovative enough. And so they were going back to the drawing board. And then like 6 weeks later, the CEO of Sidewalk Labs, who's the former deputy mayor of New York named Dan Doctoroff, one of his former colleagues happened to be working for that agency I was mentioning earlier called Waterfront Toronto. And he emailed him and said, we're working on a pilot project, and we're looking to blend urbanism and technology. Do you want to come up and maybe put a bid in for it? And that's how it all began.
I want to ask you about Toronto as kind of like a petri dish for reimagining a city. I sometimes look at my own city. I'd love to hear some. And by the way, we'll have time for questions later on, so just stick your hand up. We'll come to that. I'll let you know. But I always think of Ottawa as a weird city because it's sort of crisscrossed by a canal, a river, highway, and each of the neighborhoods is like almost feels is my own view. And if you violently disagree, I'll respect that. But like each of the neighborhoods here seems almost hermetically sealed off from the other. It's very few places in the city where one neighborhood kind of like bleeds organically into the next. Usually, like Wellington to Richmond is sort of that, like where you almost get like that Toronto feel. Anyway, that's my own little soapbox thing about Ottawa. Great city to live. But when you look at Toronto, what do you think made this the kind of, what is it about? Give us your sort of the urbanist view of Toronto as a city. What worked and what didn't, and this piece of land, how that sort of tied together the future potential of Toronto.
So this piece of land, it's a 12-acre plot of, it's like a Jenga shape, little L, like a inverse L shape, right along the waterfront at the foot of what's called Parliament Street. It's very close to the Globe and Mail's Toronto office. So I could literally see it if I looked from our south window. And this is sort of a stretch of land that was originally in contention for an Olympic bid. I believe they were in 2000. Toronto was bidding for, I believe, the 2008 Olympics. Toronto just wants to do really. Toronto's like, as I said earlier, it's an insecure place. It seemed secure when I was a maritimer, and then I moved to Toronto and I was like, this is a deeply, deeply insecure place. And there's just a desperation to be proximate to greatness. Yeah, we can get into that afterwards. But, there are a massive housing crisis. It is very, very difficult to even just rent something affordable unless you make like minimum $80,000 a year. Like literally yesterday, there was like a developer put up, this could have been fake, but a developer put up a raffle for $1,600 a month, one-bedroom condos. And people were freaking out because that's very low in Toronto. And this was not even in downtown. And so the city is always looking for ways, it's looking for magic solutions. And what Sidewalk Labs kind of presented looked like a solution. They wanted to say, like, if you come here, we'll start with these 12 acres, but maybe we'll go all across the eastern waterfront through the even more of this sort of weird post-industrial semi-wasteland. It's not actually a wasteland. There are a bunch of like movie studios there, and people do use that area, but that was conveniently left out of the talking points in a lot of cases. And people were basically smitten by this. I don't know if I actually answered your question. I think I just railed against Toronto for 5 minutes.
It's certainly a city that seems like it has vast zones of potential. And as you've seen projects spring up, like the distillery, Liberty Village, I think people have woken up and appreciated how incredible the city can be with just these types of things, the junction. And you look around the city and you see like far more vast plots. I think it still feels like a city that's like filling out, right?
Yeah, there's definitely room to grow. I mean, like Downsview, the former airport there, like there's massive opportunities there. Downsview also being a site that people said, why didn't Sidewalk just buy land there and not have to work with this strange tripartite government organization in a bid? But that's a separate matter. But yeah.
So your book opens with quotes from Jane Jacobs and also The Simpsons. What is it about the story that makes both of these relevant?
So Jane Jacobs, as I'm sure everyone in this room knows through ULI, moved from New York to Toronto, which is the opposite of most people's moves between those two cities, and was sort of one of the most well-known progressive urbanists of the past 100 years. And Sidewalk Labs often invoke her, but if you actually read her writing, it's not necessarily what Sidewalk Labs was actually preaching to do. So I printed out my own epigraph, and I'm going to read you the Jane Jacobs quote that opens the book, which is, to approach a city or even a city neighborhood as if it were a larger architectural problem, capable of being given order by converting it into a disciplined work of art, is to make the mistake of attempting to substitute art for life. The result of such profound confusion between art and life are neither life nor art. They are taxidermy. And Sidewalk Labs did not like that quote. But they like even Dan Doctoroff, the CEO, did invoke Jane Jacobs even in that sort of red carpet moment in October 2017, and it was just a very common refrain. And to encapsulate the city's reaction is I quoted from the monorail episode of The Simpsons. So I quoted from the monorail song, which surprisingly was hard to track down the copyright license to, but I'm not going to sing that for you. But basically, it's an episode of The Simpsons, for those of you who don't know, where Huckster shows up to Springfield and says that he's going to turn their city around by installing a monorail in a town of like 5,000 people. And they're smitten because it's going to put them on the map. And they don't realize that they're spending an awful lot of money while Main Street is literally crumbling around them. And I mean, the Gardner Expressway is literally crumbling, literally almost above where Sidewalk Labs put its headquarters on the waterfront. And so I just thought those two quotes really encapsulated both the sort of selective nature of how Sidewalk Labs described its intention, as well as the ways that Toronto kind of bent over backwards for something that it didn't really understand.
So give us a little bit of a narrative of the story then, and sort of how you sort of set things up earlier, and take us through a little bit of that. And then one of the issues that came up, maybe you can address this, was coming up with an effective framework for governing data, which seemed to be a big sticking point. And maybe you could talk about the challenges, the reasons for that, and what it meant for the project.
So for the first year after that big announcement, there wasn't a whole lot of detail given by Sidewalk Labs beyond just this big 200-page excerpt, not the whole thing, but an excerpt to their original request for proposals from Waterfront Toronto. And because this is a Google affiliate, people had a lot of questions about data and how data was going to be managed because, as we all now know, post Cambridge Analytica, we are the product being sold for marketing purposes, fundamentally. And our data that we generate online is being used to sell ever more effective ads. That's primarily how the internet economy works. And people wondered, well, how is this? That's the main business line of this organization. What is it going to do for cities? And Sidewalk Labs is very careful to say things like, oh, well, we will not be using any data that we might be collecting in this neighborhood to sell you ads. And we'll, eventually there will be a framework that'll come out that will show that we're going to go about this safely. But this is where things get icky. So Waterfront Toronto develops this panel. It's called the Digital Strategy Advisory Panel. It's a bunch of people who have expertise in different sort of parts of the realm of, there are urbanists there, and in fact, there are two University of Ottawa professors who are in the room tonight. Thank you for coming, who are on this panel, who I'm probably going to give PTSD recounting this story. But basically, out of nowhere, about a year after the Sidewalk Labs project is announced, they just say, here's our data governance framework. And basically the framework is they were going to put all the data in a trust that only they would have, so that they would not have any special access to, that an independent body, probably set up by the government, would manage this data trust, and people had to apply. They had to make sure that they were thinking about any damage that could be done in the way the data might be collected in this neighborhood. And by the way, all this data collection is all theoretical. They weren't sure what kind of sensors were going to be put up there or what third parties would also have access to put sensors in this sort of neighborhood of the future. But there are a couple of issues that came up. One, it doesn't matter if Sidewalk Labs knows who you are. If it has access and it applies with equal opportunity as anyone else to that data set that might be collected around this neighborhood, they already have so much data about us as human beings that is also geofenced in a certain way that they would be able to access, figure out who is going to be in a neighborhood at a given time. It didn't matter if they had equal access. They can merge those data sets and learn way more about people. And from a market advantage, if they wanted to compete with Canadian companies that wanted to try urban innovation, which, we're trying to build the Canadian tech economy, which is a lot of what Sean reports on and what I used to, Google's going to have an upper hand. But then, more orders of magnitude above that was the fact that this was a vendor of the government, of multiple levels of government, proposing public policy. And that's not how that works. They were a private company that was basically telling the government, well, why don't you just do this? the whole point of making sure that, no matter what part of the political spectrum that you're on, whether you want to make sure that the government oversees the private sector or whether you want to make sure that the market has equal opportunity for any player that's in it, that market's getting skewed if the private sector is dictating what the policy is. And this obviously frustrated certain members of the digital strategy panel. Some of them may have threatened to quit. At least one of those people who is considering quitting is in this room right now and may have used the phrase, we are like window dressing for this government panel. They did not quit. This wound up not sinking the project, but Sidewalks immediately retracted this plan because they realized that they were, basically, if some of the most esteemed specialists hired on behalf of the government were rejecting it, they retracted it. And then, we can get to this later, in 2019, they just introduced the plan again. And just like under a slightly different name as part of a 1,500-page massive document they hoped no one would read. That just gave them more controversy. But I'm getting ahead of myself, Sean.
Well, so how does the dynamic, this sort of multifaceted dynamic of the relationship shift between the various key players here, the federal, waterfront, to the provincial, the city, Google, how is that evolving through all this?
As I said, red carpet at the very beginning. Justin Trudeau got himself into numerous conspiracy theories right off the bat at the opening night when he said that he and Google chairman Eric Schmidt had been talking about doing this for a long time. Here again, we get into the fair government procurement issue of, well, did Justin Trudeau plan this and force Google to win this? Trudeau did not, but his office went very far out of their way to hide documents from me and redact documents that showed that he was in fact talking about it with Eric Schmidt. He didn't influence the process, but Eric Schmidt personally got on the phone with him and was very, very excited about that.
It's not safe to talk about procurement in Ottawa these days, right?
As I've learned. And so then things changed. When Sidewalk started to get into, within a year, so October 2018, the same time, almost the exact same day, I think, it was the 1-year anniversary of Sidewalk coming to Toronto, was when they wound up retracting this plan. It was also when I cornered myself and the former National Post reporter James McLeod, both cornered then Minister Navdeep Bains at a conference and tried to get him to talk about this. And he wound up just kind of punting it. He didn't say anything meaningful about this. And this is the person who was in charge of, at the time, basically trying to reinvent the country's private sector privacy laws. And what we were seeing over the course of the first year and a half is governments going from rolling out the red carpet to being like, oh, I don't know, we're going to just let Sidewalk Labs deal this with Waterfront Toronto. And Waterfront Toronto, whose intentions were, they just wanted to develop a really technology-first neighborhood, wound up becoming the punching bag for all sides of this, and because they were not beholden to any level of government. Each government was a 1/3 shareholder, so they were all 3 levels had a responsibility, but no one had major responsibility. So they all wound up just kind of sticking back and watching, waiting for what was going to happen, while Waterfront Toronto was languishing, basically asking people in the federal government, please develop regulations that can deal with this kind of thing, because this is not going to be the first instance of a major company, probably American, probably from Silicon Valley, trying to come in and make these sort of massive suggestions that could change the way cities are built forever. And so the attitude shifted over the course of that first year, much to the detriment of the ability to get things done. Because again, this is going to happen again. And so what Waterfront Toronto was trying to say was, maybe governments should look at what the controversies are and try to address them with policy. And they haven't. I don't believe so I know PIPEDA, the private sector privacy law, they've been promising. I think one of the last stories I wrote as a tech reporter is they reintroduced legislation, and I'm in a different job now. I don't know exactly where it's sitting in Parliament, but I believe it hasn't passed. And so even now, 7 years after the project was announced, we still are languishing in 25-year-old regulation.
So it's a bit of a morass, and then there's probably the hold my beer moment of all this, when as this ultimately grew into a battle over land and the scope of Google's ultimate ambitions for Toronto. Tell us about that.
Okay, so data makes a certain number of people mad. In Toronto, you talk about land and someone getting land like free or for cheap, people get real mad. Like land is such a deeply emotional issue. And Sidewalk Labs had very good communications people who always said that, well, the original request for proposals said that, we could probably move to the entire eastern waterfront. They selectively used like a paragraph in the back of the request for proposals. What the request for proposals actually said was, this is for 12 acres. If you hit a certain number of goals with us, we may give you first right of refusal for other portions of land along the eastern waterfront to what's called the Portlands, that place that has all those movie studios that I was talking about. And so this was all out in the open. And while I was on a holiday with my wife in Mexico, the Toronto Star broke a story saying the Sidewalk Labs wants more than the 12 acres. It was sitting out there in public. I had to field requests from my colleagues, but like, how should we cover this? I'm like, this actually isn't a controversy. But credit to the Star, they took that issue and it became the defining issue for the next year. So this was February 2019. The Star did this story where they talked about the scale of the ambitions that Sidewalk Labs had that was clear well and beyond the 12 acres. And at that point, you then had municipal politicians go from not commenting to saying, we're not going to let this happen. Other levels of government left that to the municipal politicians. And what that did was it empowered a lot of the advocates and the activists who had been trying to warn about all of the different ways that Sidewalk Labs was kind of messing up, to use the word procurement, and the ways that it could have just massive power imbalances and create this sort of major player in city building at the expense of the Canadian technology sector, at the expense of Canadian taxpayers, at the expense of Canadians' rights and freedoms when it comes to data privacy. And they were all galvanized because of the land issue. The data stuff came into that. It was all, again, already out in the open. But this was that moment, February 2019, when basically opposition coalesced into the group called Block Sidewalk. And then you actually started to have members of government openly question whether or not this was worth it.
That leads perfectly to the next question. You mentioned Jane Jacobs earlier. She showed the power of public activism decades ago, stopping large projects in New York and Toronto. Shaping the narrative often helps determine winners and losers in battles over civic infrastructure. We've seen that lots of places here, I think, too. Tell us what we can learn from how both sides took their case to the public, and what lessons you think they and their kin learned from the sidewalk battle.
I will say that I think there's power in numbers, and I think it showed on the people who were opposed to Sidewalk Labs. I think what we learned was there was a great opportunity for people who had different ideas to come in and realize the common themes behind them. And what they did was show, that all of these common themes, everyone has something in common with them, whether you're frustrated about market power, whether you're frustrated about infringements upon your rights and your privacy rights, or whether you're just mad about someone possibly getting a massive discount untendered on some of the most valuable underdeveloped real estate in North America. Governments, in terms of, I think, lessons learned and how they acted, the biggest matter I think that we learned from this is that governments need to think ahead. Governments were constantly reacting. I mean, most of the time they were doing nothing. But governments tended to react rather than saying, this is a problem, we need to get ahead of it. We need to say, this is what the future is going to look like. That, in this particular case, just as an example, but you could expand this in anything, a massive company that has cornered the market in the digital world now wants to bring that might into the physical world. What impact is that going to have? Should we be studying this? Should we be thinking preemptively about legislation and all that. So yeah, there were a lot of lessons learned in that regard. Did I answer your question? I feel like I just like shot some talking
I think
points
so.
at you.
You get an A.
I'm sitting here railing against talking points, and then I'm using talking points. So
I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to throw it to you folks. So hope you have some good ones. So Sidewalk Toronto ultimately failed. Tell us why, and what you see as the big lessons to take from this, and ultimately why should people here and anywhere else outside Toronto care?
sure. So Sidewalk Labs blamed the pandemic's effect on real estate economics for when it left in May 2020. But what actually happened, that is, it was always part of the truth. They never lied. But going back to the sort of creation of Block Sidewalk, that sort of big moment in February of 2019, a year sort of before the pandemic befell society, Waterfront Toronto basically said no. They had just gotten a new chair. The chair said, I don't care how you're acting. We're not just going to let you do all of this. They finally, I didn't even get into the part where like the CEO that brought Sidewalk in of Waterfront Toronto wound up resigning like less than a year after that came out. After the Sidewalk project had come in, the details of that are in that book. You can purchase copies of over there. Lots of details we're not talking about. But after that pushback, then in June 2019, they released this 1,500-page draft Master and Innovation and Development Plan, MIDP. Waterfront Toronto preempts this with a letter saying, we didn't co-sign this. And I wound up getting this letter saying, we reject all of these things before I even saw the 1,500-page document. And then they spent like 4 months fighting over it. And then on Halloween, they called it the Halloween Accord in 2019. Waterfront Toronto's board had a vote on whether or not it would proceed with the Sidewalk project if Sidewalk agreed to those terms, including getting rid of that data proposal for the second time, and you're only getting 12 acres. Sidewalk Labs begrudgingly says, we'll do this, but we need to think about what the numbers are. I looked at that letter, that they made that letter public during the Halloween Accord meeting in 2019, and it's one of those things I think, they call journalism the first draft of history, and then books, I guess, are the second draft, and then plays and movies, that's the final version. But in this letter, it was just sort of like, yes, we agree to your terms, but we just need to make sure the numbers work. I wish I had thought more about that line when I was doing the reporting then, because after the project got canceled and I started working on the book, that line made me realize this project was dead in October 2019. And I started, like, after the project got canceled, this is just a journalism thing, but like people who have skin in the game, particularly in Canada, don't like talking to journalists. Thank you to those who do. But after the project got canceled, I had a lot more conversations with people who were involved in these kinds of decisions. And inside Sidewalk Labs, they were like, okay, yeah, let's agree to that. But they never had a business plan for the original 12 acres. Their business plan was always contingent on like up to a minimum 190 acres that they were going to have significant powers over. And they then blamed pandemic economics for turning that around, but they didn't have a business. They were racing to get a business plan together when the pandemic upended the math they had kind of just started to do. And obviously, this did not impress the people at Google. When they walked away from Toronto, they did not get new staff. They did not try to refresh the CEO. The company sort of plodded along, laid off its Toronto staff, and the company, a few remaining pieces of it were absorbed into Google in the end of 2021.
So big takeaways then, like why does this story matter in Ottawa or Montreal or Vancouver or Cornwall or Brockville or New York City?
Two of those
Or St. John.
Two of those Canadian town names sound like the cities they made up in the Simpsons of cities that did take the monorail. It matters because this is going to happen again. It matters because people with enormous amounts of market power are always looking for new ways to activate that market power. And Toronto was just the highest profile example of an organization coming in with all of the sort of the hubris of big tech and just trying to get its way. And it, like, kind of by mistake, they were kind of put in their place. Like the systems that should be in place in any city, in any government, in any jurisdiction, like should have been in place to say, well, no, we're not going to give you more than 12 acres. Stop saying that in all of your speeches. And so the lessons are, it's like Toronto, it happened in Toronto by mistake. This happened in Toronto because of a random email that the Ontario Auditor General later surfaced from a former employee of the CEO of Sidewalk Labs coming in. It could have happened anywhere. And that was one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book, is like I happened to be the Toronto-based tech reporter when a tech company came to Toronto selling this. But when I realized that all of this just happened to be that way, like this could happen anywhere. And, yeah. Want more talking points or?
That's good. Okay, hands up, high up in the air. Someone must have a question. I'm going to pick people to ask questions.
I mean, first off, there's a lot of people in urban development in this room, so I'm probably gonna they probably have better answers than me on this. I came at this from like an investigative journalism and a technology perspective. And listen, we need the private sector to do great work in making our cities. This is not, we're not a communist country. We need the private sector to do things. What we need are for governments to set the rules and set the rules clearly. Be that on just from the beginning of the RFP process to zoning to just any land use regulations to, can we please make skyscrapers out of wood now? The tests say that they're not going to catch fire. These are things that governments are just very, so the onus is less on ooh, the private sector is at it again. And it's more like, what can governments do at all three levels of government do to both hold the private sector accountable while embracing innovation? And we just didn't see that in the Sidewalk Labs situation.
Yes.
Oh, I heard many people tell me that over the course of reporting the book. It's difficult. I mean, everyone has their own ideal version of governments. I'm just simply saying, well, one factor could be that they were proactive, but probably not going to happen. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for reading. One of the issues that came forward, I'm not going to necessarily judge this, but a lot of people I spoke to were quite frustrated with Will Fleissig, who was the chief executive officer of Waterfront Toronto, who envisioned the RFP process that brought Sidewalk. And this RFP had a lot of gaps in it that could be interpreted in many different ways, and Sidewalk Labs interpreted it constantly in its own favor. One person, well, not just one person, a lot of people argued to me when I was interviewing them for the book that Mr. Fleissig was not familiar enough with how Canadian governments work. He was American. He had spent much of his career in Colorado and in California and was not particularly familiar with just the ways the Canadian governments worked, which is funny because it was an American company that ultimately just rammed through the RFP process. And so I both disagree with that premise and also think part of it is a bit true in that Will did learn how to work with Canadian governments because he also got a much bigger project that there isn't a book written about which is the $1.2 billion redevelopment of the mouth of the Don River, which is what allowed all this to happen in the first place, because it stopped that whole area from, it will, when completed in 4 or 5 years, will stop that area from being so flood prone, and therefore it's a lot more certainty for developers to come in. So that, I know I'm talking about one person, you're asking more generally. I think we need skilled players who understand on the government side how to deal with organizations that always get what they want, and be willing to both embrace them, speak their language, and also put their foot down. Waterfront Toronto eventually got a version of that. Some people, again, disagree with this, but Stephen Diamond, who was sort of a secondary character for much of what happened throughout the saga, he was just one of the directors on the board of Waterfront. Then Mayor John Tory called him and asked him to intervene when a bunch of people quit. Again, a whole section of the book I didn't talk about. It's for sale right there. And this new chair of the board came in and he's like, "Why are you doing this?" Like he went from being like kind of just like, he didn't even show up to the vote to bring Sidewalk to Toronto. Like he was very much kind of secondary. But then when given the opportunity, and John Tory literally, like I got them to recreate the phone call. And like when I interviewed them both on the record, and basically John Tory dangled, it's like, this is in the public interest. This could be massive for our city, our province, our country, but we need someone who could put in guardrails and stand up. And that was like, when he was given that opportunity, he took that. And, he wanted this project to happen. We talked for hours, fully on the record for this book. And he really wanted the project to happen, but he wasn't gonna let them trample him. And that's the kind of attitude you need, I think, to be willing to embrace something difficult, something new, something innovative, but also be willing to understand the parameters. And having both of those personality traits, I think, if that was what the situation was from the beginning, I have a feeling Sidewalk Labs would have not run into nearly as many controversies, because it all would have happened behind the scenes, and no one would have tipped off a journalist, because it all would have gotten quashed, and then they'd be building something on the waterfront maybe right now in Toronto. You really did read the book. Wow, you're quoting me back at me. I would say that was what people told me. I don't really put any ascribing of people's personalities. Anything that I write is based on, like, I interviewed 150 people for the book. I heard that from like 10 or so different people. I called people Will Fleissig worked with in Denver 40 years ago, because I have a colleague who lives in Denver and gave me their phone numbers. Thank you, David Milstead, if he's watching a live stream. So yeah, like he was considered someone who was very visionary, but not great at execution. And right now, like the current CEO, not chair, is someone who is a lifelong bureaucrat whose whole thing is actually ramming tough things through a whole bunch of different ministries in the province of Ontario. So he's almost like the opposite in terms of how he thinks of strategy.
Anyone else?
It would be so different. So many people told me that over the course of reporting for the paper and then for the book, that like Sidewalk Labs had every opportunity to just buy land. Like Downsview was one like piece of land that was often people would just reference, which is sort of in the uptown Toronto, former, is it a base or an airport? I don't know, I should probably know. I'm from the Maritimes. I didn't get my education in Ontario. Like so many people were like, why didn't they just buy land and then be like, okay, just as a developer, have these conversations with each individual level of government? And what's interesting is that Sidewalk Labs, like people who like not on talking points, like confidential sources within the organization were telling me, like they wanted to have government buy-in from the start. They didn't want to creep up on the government. This is, again, this could be them feeding me talking points on background so that I could make it sound like I can get their talking points out, which I try to never do. But it really was like they could have just bought up a bunch of land. But by partnering with Waterfront Toronto, they also thought that Waterfront Toronto had way more powers than it did. They thought Waterfront Toronto, because it was an arm of all three levels of government, that it could get approvals, or someone would be able to go to ISED and get new privacy laws. Like, they thought that these things could be handled by Waterfront Toronto, and then Waterfront Toronto did not have those powers. It was a fundamentally paralytic organization when it came to actually getting things, communicating to its other governments, again, because it had 3 shareholders, but none of them are the majority. So they absolutely could have, but they chose not to just go out and buy land and do that. And it's one of those things, again, where I wonder, like, if they had tried that, would we be I don't think I would have written this book. I think it would have just been, something that would have been a lot less controversial, but I don't know. I also try not to think in theoreticals, so.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, so this was really interesting in that they worked with Brooke McElroy to consult with a variety of different Indigenous communities. I don't have this memorized, so I apologize to anyone who knows more about this, who was involved in this. But they were involved, basically, they, I can't remember exactly what, I could just read the book. The book's over there for anyone who wants to know the actual answer. But when I spoke with the Mississaugas of the Credit, who are the treaty holders for the land, they expressed frustration, both the chief and one of their major, one of their officers who was in charge of community outreach, who had been working with Sidewalk Labs. Stacey LaForme, the chief, was a great person to chat with. They were just like, well, why, like, if you're gonna do an Indigenous consultation, why did you not ask us to do it? We're the treaty holders and you were planning on involving us in on this. And they were frustrated that Sidewalk Labs had kind of gone over their heads. They were having 2 separate conversations. And I'm a white dude. I'm not gonna say what is the right way to go about this, but I do know the Mississaugas of the Credit, up to the level of their chief, were frustrated with them running Indigenous consultations without bringing in the Mississaugas. It's income disparity, I think. Has anyone here heard of California Forever? The development, I think it's like 50 miles north, I have to literally, east and west, I have to move my hand to figure out what it is. Northeast-ish of San Francisco. Mark Andreessen, Mike Moritz, Laureen Powell Jobs, and a variety of other billionaires are investing in, they bought up a huge plot of land, I think it's Sonoma County, and they're gonna make a new city in their own image. It's not necessarily gonna be a tech city, although their lead construction partner is run by a Sidewalk Labs alumni. But their plan is, they want to develop a city. Well, where do they live? They live in San Francisco. What does San Francisco have? A lot of unhoused people who can't afford to live in San Francisco. And the subtext sure sounds an awful lot like rich people just want to have a massive gated community that they can design on their own. And that, to me, is, I think, how tech money is being pulled into this. Now, we are also seeing versions of what Larry Page was imagining back in 10 years ago, which was Mark Laurie, he's famous because he founded diapers.com, but also Bill Gates separately. They both want to build cities in the desert, Nevada. Nevada is the target state, and maybe elsewhere. Again, the idea of as minimal regulation as possible so they can experiment and not be beholden to either regulation perhaps around autonomous vehicles, but also fewer taxes for them as developers. So that's the direction I sort of see things going in. Yeah.
Do you think we're going to see autonomous vehicles? I mean, we've already take over. We've already seen a backlash in San Francisco, and I can't imagine if the technology gets sophisticated enough that it can displace truck drivers, that there won't be a massive regulatory and political backlash.
Was it Gizmodo yesterday that had that story that Amazon stored the grab and go stores at Amazon that they could just track with AI, that you grabbed something and that they would know what you grabbed and immediately charge your credit card. And I think it was Gizmodo yesterday that broke the story that it was actually like 1,000 workers in India watching video feeds. Like, it wasn't AI. And like but what they want to do is create the illusion, right? They want to create the illusion that this product works. And I have a feeling we're just a couple years away from kind of recognizing that fully autonomous vehicles like probably have some of that sort of magic baked into them, like just, low paid labor for the sake of
Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain, right?
yeah. And so, listen, I drive a 2007 Honda Civic. I'm going to be happy when I upgrade my car to one with when I can see behind me as I'm backing up. That to me is way better than an AI powered vehicle. So I don't know if AI, I think there's some version of it's going to happen, but I don't know what it's going to look like.
I think we have time for one more question.
I haven't read the Celebration Chronicles. I did read numerous magazine investigations into Epcot, and in this magical yellow book that they literally kept under lock and key, I got to see 2 different copies of it, so that lock wasn't very good. They talked about how Epcot was the ideal. They talked about the idea of creating a city that was a corporation with a board of directors, and the directors are whom? They're the landholders. And guess who was the landholder outside of Orlando in that particular city? It was Disney. And that allowed them to have power over a lot of different things, including, I think, emergency service and various other things. And so, yeah. And so Sidewalk Labs was enamored by this and various other Epcot-related things, including Buckminster Fuller's domes and stuff. So, yeah. Yeah. We can do one more. Does anyone else have
One more? Okay.
another question? In the back. Yeah, it's you in the orange. I think it's orange. It's bright up here.
The play.
I mean, yeah, for sure. I mean, listen, this guy's book got adapted into Blackberry. Glenn Howerton was robbed of Best Supporting Actor Oscar.
But the movie didn't have a tree as the narrator, which your play adaptation did. So let's hear from you.
So before the book came out, a former Globe employee, was on the board of a nonprofit theater called Crows in Toronto. They were interested. They had just tapped into a fund that would allow them to adapt Canadian literature for the stage, and they had just had massive success adapting Andre Alexis's incredible 15 Dogs for the stage. And in fact, my favorite actor from that actually wound up playing the tree and me in this play, which is weird to also be a character in a play. I brought my mom to the first night. Her mouth dropped. I was like the comic foil. I came in and I was like, by the way, I just got this document from Sidewalk Labs. What do you think, government? And anyway, a character smashes their head into a cake and result. It was really interesting because as you can probably tell, I don't take myself very seriously, but I do take my work very seriously. And everything in that book is minimum double sourced from either multiple people or documents because I really want to make sure I'm not getting played. I really want to make sure that the actual truth gets out there. And then when I signed away the rights for the stage, I no longer had control over that. So for me, it was journalistically was a very fascinating experience to unpack because I wanted to get the facts to tell the story. But Michael Healy, the playwright, who I believe is currently his play Proud, I believe is playing somewhere in Ottawa sometime soon. I saw a poster for it when I was walking around. He's a great satirist. He cared more about themes and the bigger picture things that we could learn from what happened with Sidewalk Labs and how very insecure Toronto dealt with this. and what it means to both be afraid of change, but also what happens when you embrace change too fast. And I did consult on a few drafts of the play. And just kept pointing out, like, this happened this way, this is in the wrong order, this and that. And he took the feedback and he said, I want it to be as factually accurate as possible, except for I'm trying to make a point or make a joke. So he took like half my notes, and the rest he just said, well, now the narrator is a tree. So that's sort of how things happened. It hasn't toured anywhere yet. I think it's going to be remounted in Toronto in a couple of months, but it was a very fun experience. Thank you for asking.
And Josh wrote an article about the process of adaptation and letting your, as you say, your double-sourced nonfiction baby out into the world to be reinterpreted by people who aren't necessarily wed to the same standards as you are. And
I interviewed Sean for that story because he had just gone through that with the Blackberry movie. Yeah. So we're going to take one more question because the person who's going to give the wrap-up remarks is currently taking a picture of the room. Hi, Dina. So anybody else have any other questions? I mean, everything they tried, they spent minimum $300 million and have nothing to show for it. It was a failure for the people who worked there, who now have a failed project on their resumes. It was a failure for City of Toronto's ambitions. It was a failure for Larry Page's ambitions. I do believe it was a success in that, that some of these ideas are possible, but in everything that Sidewalk Labs stated it was going to do, it did not do. And in terms of the goals that it set for itself, it failed, which I think that's probably the best baseline to make that statement from. And there was another question in the front. That's a fascinating question. And so for the research for this book, I spent time doing interviews in New York and also in Berlin, where there was a massive grassroots opposition to a Google startup campus. That the opposition to what happened in Toronto raised a lot of major issues, but was not why it was canceled. The opposition in Berlin is why it was canceled. Google just said this is not worth the headache and spent 14.5 million euros retrofitting the space for nonprofits to just get rid of the headache. Canada's in a really weird spot in that, like, it's not like the EU is a bloc. It has all of these different countries that work together to do something. Canada kind of stands alone above the United States. The average Canadian consumes primarily American pop culture, and thinks of itself as adjacent to the United States and does not necessarily look to Europe as an example. I wound up doing a long feature for the Globe about what Canada can learn from the EU from my time that I spent over there, because there was just a much more willingness to say, to question when power is exerted on you, as it is by tech companies. What kind of questions should we be asking, which the EU does a great job of. But Canada does, by nature of just the imposing physical presence of the United States, tends to lean more to what's going on in the United States, which is why you saw for many years, Justin Trudeau trying to get selfies with Jeff Bezos, with Eric Schmidt, with Tim Cook, and every other billionaire executive. And so Canada could learn from either jurisdiction, but I think just within the geopolitics of it all, the geography is inseparable from that. And I think Canada is always going to look to the US first. I mean, maybe it won't, but in my experience from studying these matters, that seems to be the case.
I think we get angrier when people pay $16 for a glass of orange juice on the public dime than anything like that. But it's a great question. I'm actually going to think about that. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sean, for all the great questions.
Thank all of you for the questions.
Thank you to the Urban Lands Institute for having me for this. Thank you to Dina for setting this up, Dina Sarhan. Thank you to the gallery for hosting this event. This is really fun. I haven't done one of these in a couple of months, and I really enjoyed it. Thank you as well to Perfect Books, which is going to be selling copies of Sideways over there if you want to hear all the things I didn't talk about. And yeah, thank you all. Dina, do you have anything you wanted to say?